Am I the jerk for cutting ties with my parents after they used my wedding fund for my twin sister? Here's my story. I'm 23F, and I need to lay out the whole situation. My twin sister Allison and I have been rivals for as long as I can remember. That might sound normal for siblings, but in our case, it wasn't just between us. Our parents fueled the competition, even if they didn't realize it. They've always treated Allison like she's special, while I felt like an afterthought. We're twins, so it seems like we should have been treated the same, right? But no, ever since we were born, Allison has been their favorite. And it all comes down to one thing: she's 12 minutes older than me. Yes, just 12 minutes. But that made all the difference to them. Growing up, it was always about her. Allison was their miracle baby, the one who could do no wrong. I wasn't a bad kid, but no matter how well I did, she got all the praise. If she brought home a C on a test, they'd say, "Oh honey, you did your best." But when I scored an A, I barely got a nod. One time in elementary school, I won a major award for a science fair project. I'd worked tirelessly on it. It was a baking soda and vinegar volcano, but I put my all into it. When I proudly showed my parents my ribbon, they just said, "That's nice, but Allison had a tough day. Can we talk about this later?" After that, I stopped showing them any awards. What hurt the most was that they didn't even try to hide the favoritism. They acted like it was completely normal to treat us so differently. My dad used to joke about how Allison was the firstborn, and even though it was by just 12 minutes, it somehow made her the older sister. It drove me crazy. As kids, I'd scream at them, demanding to know why they treated her like she was special and ignored me. My mom would just brush it off, saying I was too sensitive, while Allison would smirk. This dynamic followed us through high school. I threw myself into academics, sports, and extracurriculars, anything to get their attention. I thought if I could outshine Allison, maybe they'd finally see me. I was top of my class, joined every club I could, and even made the varsity soccer team. I wasn't a slacker, but no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. Meanwhile, Allison coasted through life, doing the bare minimum and relying on her charm. She was great at playing the victim, and people always rallied around her, telling her how wonderful she was. Meanwhile, I was working tirelessly with nothing to show for it. One Thanksgiving when I was 16, my drunk uncle let it slip that my parents hadn't even planned on having twins. They only wanted one child. When they found out they were having two, my mom panicked about handling two babies, and my dad, in his typical way, just said, "We'll figure it out." But figuring it out, to them, meant giving all the attention to one child, Allison. I was sitting at the dinner table when he said that, and everything clicked. All those years of wondering why my parents didn't care about my accomplishments suddenly made sense. I wasn't the child they had wanted. Allison was. That realization made me give up on trying to win their approval. I stopped caring about their opinions and focused on myself. After high school, I got into a top business school with a full scholarship, graduating as valedictorian. Allison, meanwhile, barely passed and went to a regular college. My graduation was a huge milestone for me, but my parents didn't even bother to attend. My mom told me, "We can't make it, sweetie. Allison needs us to help her move out of her dorm." It felt like another slap in the face, but by then I was used to it. Allison always came first. Deep down, I still hoped they'd realize how unfair they were being, but that never happened. When we turned 21, Allison had a massive birthday party, paid for entirely by our parents. They covered everything: venue, catering, all of it. Meanwhile, all I got was a $50 gift card. I didn't even bother going to her party. I couldn't stand being there while everyone celebrated her, and I was left feeling invisible. At that time, both of us were living at home again. Allison had graduated but couldn't find a job, so she was just lounging around, while I was interning at a major firm, working hard to build my future. But my parents didn't care about that. They were more worried about Allison's job search than my actual career. The final straw came when I found out about the wedding fund. My grandma, who always understood how my parents treated us, left both Allison and me an equal amount of money for our weddings. She made sure we each had the same share because she knew how things were. But what did my parents do? They spent my portion on Allison's wedding. They used my inheritance, the money meant for my future, on her. I only found out during a Thanksgiving dinner when my uncle, once again drunk, started talking about how costly Allison's wedding was and how my parents had to use both of our wedding funds to cover it. I was furious. They hadn't even asked me, they just used my money like it didn't matter. The next day, I confronted them, hoping they might apologize or try to make things right. Instead, they just shrugged and said they'd pay me back. They didn't seem to grasp why I was so angry. My dad even said, "Well, Allison needed it more." "You're more responsible, you'll understand someday." Hearing that, I was done. Without hesitation, I packed up my things and left. It wasn't some dramatic departure, but it was clear I couldn't stay in a place where I felt invisible. I just wanted to disappear from their lives, the same way they had always overlooked me. I'd clung to the hope that they'd eventually see how unfair they were being, but it was obvious that day would never come. It was time for me to move on. I remember the day I left like it was yesterday. Sitting in my room, staring at the walls, I wondered how things had gotten so bad. I dug out an old suitcase from high school and started tossing in clothes. I didn't pack much, just the essentials. The ironic part is, no one even noticed. My parents were downstairs, probably discussing Allison or whatever, oblivious to what I was doing. Maybe they thought I was just heading out for the day, but they didn't ask where I was going. Not a word. I packed my things and walked out while they stayed inside, completely unaware. It felt strange, almost like I was sneaking out, but at the same time, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I wasn't angry anymore, just exhausted. Tired of being overlooked, tired of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I was ready to move on from them, from the favoritism, and all the baggage that came with it. I didn't have a concrete plan at first, but luckily, I had some good friends who let me crash at their place temporarily. It wasn't ideal, but I knew it wouldn't be forever. The internship I had at the time had hinted at a full-time position, so I wasn't too worried about getting back on my feet. I knew I'd make it eventually, and frankly, that was more than I could say for Allison. Living with friends turned out to be a breath of fresh air. They made me feel like I mattered, which was something I hadn't felt in a long time. We'd hang out after work, watch movies, grab food, doing all the things I should have done with my own family but never did. Being around people who genuinely cared helped me realize just how messed up my situation with my parents had been. One night, after we ordered pizza and were lounging on the couch, one of my friends asked about my parents. I hadn't opened up much about the situation before, just mentioned that we weren't close. But that night, everything came pouring out. I told them how my parents had always favored Allison, how they'd used my wedding fund for her, and how they didn't even check on me when I left. As I talked, I began to see just how much it had all affected me. My friends were shocked, unable to believe how blatant the favoritism was. One of them said, "No wonder you left. That's messed up." Hearing someone else say it validated my feelings, like I wasn't just being overly sensitive. It was a messed up situation, and leaving had been the right choice. After a few weeks with my friends, things started looking up. My internship turned into the full-time job I'd been hoping for, which meant I could finally afford my own place. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. I'd earned it all by myself, no help from my parents, just my hard work. Moving into that apartment was one of the best days of my life. I remember standing in the empty living room, looking at the bare walls, thinking, I did this. It felt like a fresh start, a clean break from everything that had gone wrong with my family. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I settled into my new life quickly. Work was going great, and I finally felt like I had control over my own future. There was no more competition with Allison, no more worrying about what my parents thought. It was just me, living my life the way I wanted, and that felt like a huge relief. Of course, there were moments when I thought about my family. I'm not heartless. I'd wonder how they were doing, if they ever thought about me. But every time I considered calling them, I stopped myself. What was the point? I knew they hadn't changed, and I wasn't ready to go back to the way things were not after everything I'd been through. Then my birthday came around, my first one since moving out. A small part of me hoped they'd reach out, maybe even apologize and try to make things right. But when the day arrived, the only call I got was about a plumbing issue at the house. They didn't even wish me a happy birthday. That's when it hit me, they really didn't care. Not about me, not about what I'd been through. To them, I was just someone they could rely on for help when it suited them, but never someone they actually cared about. After that, I made a promise to myself I wasn't going to let them drag me down anymore. I had managed just fine without them, and I would continue to thrive on my own. I had friends, a job, my own place, everything I needed. I didn't need their approval to feel good about my life. I realized I was better off without them. A couple of months later, Life in my new apartment was finally settling into place. I was getting used to living on my own, and work was going well. Every little thing felt like an accomplishment: paying bills, decorating my space, having a place to call my own at the end of the day. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine, and for the first time I felt in control of my life. I hadn't spoken to my parents since I'd left. It wasn't like I was avoiding them, but I wasn't making any effort to reconnect either. They hadn't reached out, so I figured they were content with things the way they were. Honestly, I didn't miss them, not really. Sure, there were moments when I'd wonder if they ever thought about me, but I wasn't sitting around waiting for their call. Then one day, I got a call, only it wasn't from them, it was from my uncle. I hadn't heard from him in years, so when his name popped up on my screen, I almost ignored it, but curiosity won out, and I answered. "Hey, it's Uncle Greg," he began, his voice unsteady. I could tell right away that something was wrong. He was usually an upbeat guy, even when times were tough. "I need to talk to you about your parents." My heart sank. I had no idea what he was about to say, but I knew it wouldn't be good. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "They've been in an accident," he explained. "A pretty bad one. They're in the hospital." I froze. I couldn't find the words. My mind immediately went to hoping they were okay. They had to be, right? But he kept talking, filling in the gaps I hadn't asked for. Apparently, they were driving home from some event when a truck hit their car. My mom was seriously hurt, and my dad was in critical condition. They'd been in the hospital for days, and no one had thought to contact me until now. "They wanted me to let you know," he said, his tone softer. "I think they want to see you." I didn't know how to feel about that. After everything that had happened between us, they were reaching out now? Part of me thought maybe maybe they'd finally realized how messed up things had been and wanted to make amends. But another part of me felt it was too convenient, too easy. I asked if Allison had been around, and Uncle Greg said she had shown up once but didn't stay long. She was too occupied with her new family and didn't want to be away from her stepkids for too long. Classic Allison, always focused on herself. But here's the kicker: when she learned they didn't have health insurance, she refused to help. She didn't want to ask her wealthy husband for money so soon after the wedding, and she certainly didn't want to take on the expenses herself. So my parents were left with no savings, no insurance, and now they were turning to me to handle their medical bills. As Uncle Greg continued, my anger grew. I didn't wish harm on my parents, but this was the first time they'd tried to contact me in 2 years, and it wasn't to apologize or make things right. It was because they needed financial help. After everything they'd done, spending my wedding fund, overlooking me, always putting Allison first, they had the nerve to ask me for support. I felt torn, guilty even, for considering saying no. They were my parents after all, but I couldn't just forget everything that had happened. They hadn't cared about me in years, and now they wanted me to bail them out. "I don't know what to do," I admitted to Uncle Greg. It wasn't a lie, I was truly lost. He paused for a moment before replying, "I understand. I know things have been rough between you and them, but they're in a tough spot. Just think about it, okay?" I told him I would, but as soon as I hung up, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. No matter how far I'd come, how much distance I'd put between us, they still had a way of dragging me back into their chaos. For the next few days, I wrestled with the decision. Should I help them? Should I visit them in the hospital? Was this a test, or were they truly that desperate? I tried to see things from their perspective, but it was hard. If the roles were reversed, would they have helped me? I wasn't so sure. At first, I kept the call to myself. It felt too complicated to explain, and I didn't want my friends to think I was heartless. After all, what kind of daughter refuses to help her parents after an accident? But then again, what kind of parents ignore their child for years, only to reach out when they need money? Eventually, one of my friends noticed that I seemed off, and I ended up telling her everything. We were just hanging out in my apartment when she asked if I was okay. I must have been doing a terrible job hiding my stress because she wouldn't drop it. I told her about the accident, the call from Uncle Greg, and how my parents were expecting me to cover their medical expenses. She listened carefully, and when I finished, she said, "Honestly, I don't think you owe them anything." Hearing that made me feel better, but it didn't make my decision any easier. She was right. After everything they'd put me through, I didn't owe them anything. Yet, I felt like I was balancing between doing the right thing and doing what was best for me, unsure of which side to choose. For days, I felt like I was stuck in a fog. my mind looping between should I help them, and they don't deserve my help. It was mentally exhausting, and I felt like I'd end up feeling guilty no matter what I decided. It was frustrating because I hadn't asked to be dragged back into their lives, yet here I was, caught in the middle again. I kept reminding myself that I didn't owe them anything. They had used my wedding money for Allison and barely acknowledged me unless they needed something. So why should I rush in now just because they were in trouble? It's not like they'd ever done that for me. Still, that nagging voice wouldn't go away, the one that kept whispering, "But they're your parents," making me feel guilty even considering refusing. That guilt gnawed at me for days. I kept worrying about what others would think if they knew the whole story, like what kind of person lets their parents struggle after an accident. But I knew the truth, and that made it even more complicated. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep torturing myself. I needed to make a decision, one way or the other, so I could stop feeling like I was stuck in limbo. After much back and forth, I finally made up my mind I wasn't going to help them. It might sound harsh, I know, but when I thought it over, I realized this wasn't really about the accident or the medical expenses. It was about the years of being treated like I didn't matter, unless they needed something, and the fact that they only reached out now because they were desperate. If the accident hadn't happened, I doubt I'd ever have heard from them again, and that realization made my decision clear. Once I made up my mind, I felt an odd sense of relief, like a burden had been lifted. I still didn't feel great about it, but at least I wasn't trapped in that endless loop of uncertainty anymore. It felt like I was finally moving forward. I knew I couldn't avoid them forever, though. They'd been calling and texting nonstop, and I couldn't keep dodging their attempts to reach me. So, one evening after work, I sat down, bracing myself for the conversation. I figured it was time to make my stance clear. I thought about sending a text, but that seemed too impersonal, so I opted to call instead. When my mom answered, it was clear she'd been waiting for this moment. Her voice sounded strained, like she was barely keeping her emotions in check. She jumped right in, detailing how bad things were and how much they needed my help. I let her talk, responding with a few ahs here and there, but my mind was already set. When she finally paused, I said, "Mom, I'm sorry you're going through this, but I can't help with the bills." Silence hung on the other end, thick with tension. I could almost feel her trying to hold back, but then she snapped. "What do you mean you can't help? We're your parents. You can't just abandon us like this," she shouted, her voice breaking. For a second, I thought she might cry, but instead, she just kept yelling. I tried to explain. I told her that after everything that had happened between us, after all the years of being disregarded, I didn't feel like I owed them anything. I told her that it wasn't my job to solve their problems when they never cared about mine. That didn't sit well with her. "You're ungrateful," she hissed. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us." I couldn't help but chuckle a little. "Mom, everything you've done for me, like what spending my wedding money on Allison, treating me like I was invisible unless you needed something that pushed her over the edge." She started ranting about how they had no choice, how Allison needed the money more, how they always put their kids first. It was clear she couldn't see how absurd she sounded. After listening to her go on for a while, I realized there was no point in continuing. She wasn't going to understand my side, and I wasn't going to change my mind, so I let her finish. When she finally ran out of things to say, I simply responded, "I'm sorry, Mom, I really am, but I can't help you," and hung up. I sat there for a while, staring at my phone, feeling a jumble of emotions: relief, guilt, frustration. It was strange. On one hand, I knew I had made the right choice for myself, but on the other, it felt like I had just severed ties with my own family. Then again, had they ever truly been my family? The fallout came quickly. My mom called back almost immediately, but I didn't answer. She left a long, rambling voicemail, accusing me of being ungrateful and abandoning them in their time of need, all the typical guilt trips. I deleted it without listening to the whole thing. My dad stayed silent, which wasn't surprising. He rarely spoke up except to grumble about how I should be more like Allison. I suppose he thought my mom would handle it, just like she always had. Then came messages from Uncle Greg, who seemed to want to play peacemaker. He urged me to reconsider, reminding me that family was important and that I'd regret this decision one day. I appreciated his concern, but it didn't change my mind. I wasn't about to give in. Eventually, I blocked their numbers. I didn't need the constant pressure and drama in my life. I felt bad about blocking my uncle, but I knew he'd keep pushing if I didn't. He meant well, but he couldn't understand what it was like to grow up in that environment, always being the second choice. And that was it. I had made my decision, and I was sticking to it. Update: it's been about a week since I made that call and officially cut ties with my parents. After that conversation with my mom, I expected a lot of backlash, but honestly, it's been quieter than I anticipated. They haven't reached out directly since I blocked them, and for the first time in ages, I feel like I can breathe. No more guilt trips, no more manipulation, just peace. It feels like I can finally move forward. Work is going well, I've got my apartment in order, and I'm focusing on myself for a change. But of course, that peace didn't last long. One evening, I was sitting in my living room, catching up on work emails when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and most of my friends usually text before dropping by. I figured it might be a delivery, but when I opened the door, there she was, Allison. I hadn't seen her since I moved out, and I wasn't thrilled to see her now. She looked different, polished, like she'd walked straight out of a magazine, with her perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes. She carried herself with that same old air, like the world revolved around her. But despite her polished exterior, I knew exactly who stood before me. "Hey," she said, smiling like we were old friends. I didn't reply at first, too stunned to process why she was even here. After everything that had happened, she was the last person I expected to see at my door. A part of me wanted to shut the door in her face, but curiosity got the better of me, so I stepped aside and let her in, even though I had a sinking feeling about what was coming next. She strolled in, glancing around as if assessing the place, probably comparing it to her new life with her wealthy husband. I didn't care. I was proud of what I had, knowing I'd earned it myself, unlike her, who'd always had someone else to lean on. After a few awkward seconds of silence, she finally spoke. "I wanted to talk to you about Mom and Dad," she said, as if that should come as a surprise. Of course she wanted to talk about them. Why else would she show up out of the blue? Instead of addressing the main issue right away, she started talking about her life, her husband, her stepkids, and how everything was going wonderfully for her. It was like she couldn't help but flaunt how great things were, even when the conversation was supposed to be serious. I listened, nodding here and there, but my thoughts were already elsewhere, waiting for her to get to the real reason she had shown up. I knew what this was. Allison wasn't here out of kindness. She never was. After what seemed like ages, she finally got to the point. "Mom and Dad are still really struggling, you know. They've been through a lot, and they need help." I just looked at her, wondering what she expected. Did she think I'd suddenly change my mind just because she showed up and tried to guilt trip me? If anything, it just irritated me more. "They don't need my help," I replied, keeping my tone as level as I could. "They have other family members. Why aren't they reaching out to them for support?" Allison gave me a look, as if I was being unreasonable. "You know how they are. They don't want to ask for help from anyone else." That's when I realized what this visit was truly about. It wasn't just about our parents. Allison didn't want to deal with them herself. She came to me to offload that responsibility. Typical. "They already asked me," I said, trying to stay calm, and I told them no. Allison's expression shifted, her smile vanishing as she looked at me like I'd just done something unthinkable. "You told them no? They're our parents, and they're in the hospital, and you just said no." I felt anger rising, but I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. "Yeah, Allison," I said, "no. After everything they've put me through, after ignoring me all these years, they reach out only because they need money. I don't owe them anything." She started to say something, but I cut her off. "You don't get it, Allison. You've always been the favorite. Everything was always handed to you. I had to fight for every little thing. Now that they're struggling, they think they can just come to me for help. No, it doesn't work that way." Allison stared at me, probably shocked that I was standing up for myself. I guess she wasn't used to this side of me. "I came here because they need you," she said finally, her voice softer. "They don't have anyone else." I shook my head. "They have you. You've always been their priority, so why don't you help them?" Her face twisted into a bitter expression. "I have my own family now. I can't keep running back and forth between them, my husband, and my stepkids. I have responsibilities." There it was, the real reason she was at my door. It wasn't about helping our parents, it was about making sure she wouldn't have to do it herself. My response was easy. Then you understand why I said no. Allison didn't have a comeback. She just stood there, likely trying to figure out how to twist the situation in her favor, but I wasn't falling for it this time. After a few moments, she finally said, "I just thought you'd be better than this." I almost laughed. Better than this? I'm finally standing up for myself, and you're trying to guilt trip me for it. I walked over to the door and opened it. "Yeah, well, I thought you'd be better than asking me to clean up your mess." She didn't reply as she walked out, just gave me one last look before leaving. I shut the door behind her and let out a long breath, feeling like I'd been holding it in the entire time. I knew this wouldn't be the last I'd hear from her or my parents, but for now, I was done. They could sort things out without me. For the first time in years, I felt like I had taken back control, and honestly, it felt pretty great. So, am I the a-hole?